All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Judith Rolls, and I'm the Senior Associate Director for the Alumni and Family Engagement Office here at Davidson College. I'm joined by my colleague, Anna Watson, who's our Digital Events Fellow, and we are thrilled to welcome each of you here tonight for this virtual book club discussion with Shelley Rigger, our Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty, and the Brown Professor of Asian Politics. She talks to us about her book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. Before I turn the program over to Shelley, I just have a few quick announcements. First of all, thanks for our overwhelming number of RSVPs. Tonight's program is using our Zoom webinar format. So participants are not able to see one another, but I did want to share that we have close to 100 or I think a few more folks on the call tonight. I do want to encourage folks to submit questions throughout the call using our Q&A feature. Don't hesitate to post your questions as you hear things while Shelley is talking. She's going to do her best to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A segment. And again, since this is a book club, she is hoping and anticipating lots of great questions are coming from our audience members this evening. Do note that we have enabled our auto live transcription for this call. To enable this on your end, you can click the Show Closed Caption or CC button on your screen and subtitles should appear. Please note that the captions are not always accurate, so we ask for your understanding. And now for our program. We're incredibly honored to have with us this evening a deeply respected leader within our own community and one of the world's foremost authorities on East Asian politics. At Davidson, she serves as the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty, and the Brown Professor of Asian Studies. Her academic journey began with a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a PhD in government from Harvard University. Over her distinguished career, she's taken her research directly to the region, serving as a Fulbright Scholar at National Taiwan University, a visiting researcher at National Zhong Churk, I'm hoping I said that right.
Yes, that's good.
University, and a visiting professor at two universities in mainland China, Fudan University and Chiao Tong University. Beyond her academic roles, she is a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a director of the Taiwan Fund, and a trusted advisor who regularly consults with the U.S. government officials on Taiwan policy. You've frequently seen her expert insights featured on NPR, NBC News, Bloomberg, and Yahoo News. Tonight, she's here to talk with us about her latest book for general readers, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. She will be sharing personal insights on cross-strait relations, the Silicon Shield, and how Taiwanese investment and culture shapes modern China. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Shelley.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you here in the Music Library in Sloan. For those of you who don't recognize the background, we're doing things in lots of new places now as we wait for the fabulous renovation of the E.H. Little Library to become the George L. Abernathy Library. Halfway through, 1 year to go, and in the interim, we are finding all the cute little niches all over campus to do fun things. So nothing more fun for me than to talk about my favorite subject, which is Taiwan, and to talk to my favorite people, which are the alumni and friends of Davidson College. So I thought I would begin just by talking a little bit about how this book came to be, because it's a little mysterious. I am a political scientist. All my degrees are in something political science or political science adjacent, but this is really a book about business and economics. And so it's a fair question. What am I doing actually? What kind of academic malpractice is this that a political scientist is writing about business? So how I came to this book was just living through the process of Taiwan's latter stages of Taiwan's domestic economic miracle. So my first trip to Taiwan was in 1983, which Taiwan was already a highly industrialized country with a lot of export manufacturing by 1983, but it was still along that journey to becoming the incredible economic powerhouse that we know it to be today. So I was kind of growing up with Taiwan's economy and looking at politics, looking at elections and political parties, but also just constantly noticing these economic forces kind of in the background that seemed to be really powerful drivers of the political changes that I was focusing on. So then at the same time, I was also paying a lot of attention to Taiwan's relationship to mainland China, so to the People's Republic of China on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And that, obviously, as everyone knows, is a really fraught and difficult political relationship and has been as long as I've been studying Taiwan. But also has had this incredible economic undercurrent that seem to be working very much against the politics. So if the politics is pulling the two sides apart, economics seems to be trying to resist that tension and bring them together. There's a whole literature in political science, specifically in the study of international relations, about that dynamic. Like, what does economic interaction do to the political relationships between countries? So there were all these interesting questions kind of brewing in the academic and intellectual world, but also really practical questions that those of us who were interested in Taiwan were asking ourselves and each other. And a really big one in the 1990s. So in my first few years at Davidson, the big question was, so much of Taiwan's manufacturing is going to mainland China. What's going to be left for Taiwan's own domestic economy? So I was going to lots of conferences where people would ask each other, like, is Taiwan's economy hollowing out? What's going to happen? This looks like a real disaster in the, that they outsourced all their manufacturing. What's left? So all of those things are like, while I'm publishing articles about elections and national identity and youth attitudes and all these other things, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking all of these questions seem to be really sitting on top of these economic trends that are just so incredibly interesting. So I wrote a book for general readers called Why Taiwan Matters that came out in 2001. And I really loved that experience. Like, writing for academics is the worst, you have to just do a lot of work that's not fun. And you cannot say anything about Buzz Lightyear in a book for academic readers. But books for general readers they're supposed to be fun to read. I hope it was at least a little fun to read, but they're really fun to write because you don't need to, prove everything to the nth degree. You don't have to have a gazillion footnotes and all the data. You're telling stories. And what I hope is that there's enough weight behind those stories that they are persuasive, but also you're telling stories, if you're an academic, that are informed by a lot of actual reading in the academic literature. So while there's not a gazillion footnotes, there are a few, and they are the foundation that gives me the confidence, to make the claims that I'm making. So anyway, I've was doing a lot of other things, but I'm just marinating in all these questions about the economy. And then in the 2000s, in that decade, we started getting a lot of questions here in Taiwan Watcher land. Is this economic relationship between Taiwan and mainland China making Taiwan vulnerable to political pressure from the PRC? And I wrote a few things about that. And I just started thinking, you know what? It is a two-way street. It's not all the mainland gaining leverage over Taiwan. There's also something else happening in the other direction. And I want to say this I want to find a way to say this. So I asked the editor that I had worked with on Why Taiwan Matters at Rowman and Littlefield, can I do this other thing? And she said, that sounds fantastic. But one thing after another, so many projects, so many wonderful courses to teach, so many interesting things to do at Davidson. And this book was always the last priority. And a lot of it, over the years, I wrote probably the first two-thirds, but I just could never quite get to the end. 2019-20, I had a sabbatical, another one of the miracles of my profession for real. And I had a Fulbright half a year. The first half of the year, I was supposed to be in Taiwan. The second half of the year, the academic year, this is 2019-2020, second half of the year, I'm supposed to be in Shanghai. So I went to Taiwan in the fall. I did all of my Fulbright application work. It was a big project on youth attitudes, had a whole team of graduate students who were doing focus groups with young people, asking all these questions, spending a lot of money paying everybody to help me out. Got to the end of that in January of 2020. I headed out to Shanghai. First, I had to go to Hong Kong to get a visa because the way things work, that was the only way to get into China. So went to Hong Kong to get the visa. I left Hong Kong for mainland China on January 21st, 2020. It was Chinese New Year. So the city was deserted to begin with, which was really cool because Shanghai is usually so crowded and busy and like kind of intense, but it was absolutely peaceful. I took a walk literally down the middle of Huaihai Road, which is one of the busiest streets in the world. Um, but as, on the first day, that's okay because it's Chinese New Year, nobody's supposed to be here. But on the second day, it was even quieter. On the second day, January 20, I guess it was January 23rd, 2020, I had lunch with the guy from the US consulate in Shanghai. I said, so, here I am. I'm here till April. What's going on? And he said, well, there's this situation out west in Wuhan. We don't really know what it is. We're not panicking, but, we are watching closely. That afternoon, after lunch, they locked down the city of Wuhan. And I thought, I have to get out of here, right? Because the experience of the SARS crisis in 2002, 2003, people who had an elevated temperature in the subway were sent home to quarantine. I had no one to bring me food, no one to bring me water. I thought, I can't stay here if there's a health crisis. So a week later, the Fulbright director in Taiwan, Randall Nadeau, who is thanked in the book because what I think most Fulbright directors were doing was sending people back to the US as borders closed. But he said, I said, I need to leave China, but I don't know what to do. And he said, just come back to Taiwan. If that was the wrong decision for Fulbright headquarters, I will take the blame for that. But you don't have to go back to the US. You can come back to Taiwan. It's safe here. So such a wonderful opportunity to then have another 3 months in Taiwan with nothing to do because I had spent all my research money in the fall. So for the 3 months remaining to me on my Fulbright, I stood in a coffee shop in downtown Taipei and finished writing this book. So the existence of the book is a direct result of the pandemic and Randall Nadeau's very wise and generous decision not to send all of his Fulbrights back to the US, but to let us stay in Taiwan as long as it was safe to be there. And of course, as we discovered over the course of the pandemic, Taiwan was pretty much the safest place in the world to be. And I only came home when I did because I was so worried about people here not understanding how serious the threat was. So the last thing I did before I flew home was I went to the fabric market in downtown Taipei and I bought a huge bolt of the kind of fabric that face masks are made of, and a huge bolt of elastic. And I came home and I set up my sewing machine and I sewed masks until finally masks were available to Americans, you know, months and months into the pandemic. So that's how the book came to be, just kind of a series of really interesting questions that I felt compelled to answer in a way that would speak to people who were struggling with the question that I think we all should be struggling with, which is, how is it possible that a country with no private property in 1978 can be the factory to the world 25 years later? So that's what the book is about. And that is all I wanted to say as a starting thing, because I really believe that Davidson alumni will have questions for me. Davidson alumni and friends of Davidson will have questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Shelley, I had not heard your story of how the book came to be, so thank you for sharing that and a different perspective on the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I do have some questions coming in.
Okay.
And this is a great opportunity, as Shelley, you heard directly from Shelley, and I'll remind you, feel free to post your questions for Shelley about her book, or just put it out there for probably anything related to this topic, knowing that she is such, of course, an expert in it. So I'll start you off here. This one is from Ben Ray, class of 2022. I say these names because I don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
Students or former students, rather. Hi, Dr. Rigger. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us tonight. What is your understanding at this point on how the Trump administration's recent trip to China and subsequent comments regarding Taiwan defense and the possible arms deal have or have not changed the state of cross-strait affairs?
Yes. Well, the Trump administration is nothing if not mysterious on these topics. So on one day, Trump says, these arms sales are a great bargaining chip for me to use with Beijing, which is really not at all what Taiwan's advocates want to hear, because you never want to be a bargaining chip, because that means that you might well be traded away for something that the person who's trading you wants more. And then immediately thereafter, Trump said, I'm going to have a phone call with the Taiwanese president. I don't know why he wants to have a phone call with the Taiwanese president. One possibility is that if you tell him he can't do something, he's going to want to do it. That's certainly why he had a phone call with the Taiwanese president in the weeks before his inauguration back in 2016. People may remember there was a kerfuffle about that. Another possibility is that his intention in speaking to the Taiwanese president is to, in fact, scold him or, tell him, you need to shape up. After his conversation about Taiwan with Xi Jinping, Donald Trump did say, I think I know more than almost anybody about Taiwan right now. And that's also worrisome, because everything he knew about Taiwan at that moment, he learned from Xi Jinping, whose perspective is very specific and may not fully capture the range of U.S. interests at stake here. So it also seems to me that he might have thought that maybe the Chinese would like for him to talk to the Taiwanese president to kind of put him in his place. But here, again, I think it's a misinterpretation. The only thing worse than Trump doing nothing about Taiwan is Trump speaking directly to the Taiwanese president, because for the PRC, that's just a red line that they've established over and over and over again. And they've been very clear with US officials, this is something that you must not do. And I don't know what his intention is in offering to do that, but I do know that Xi Jinping and his fellow leaders in Beijing cannot accept that this is well intentioned because it's just too much of a violation of all of the agreements that they thought they had with the US. So, in answer to Ben's question, I think it just leaves things in a very unsettled state where each side's, well, especially the US side's intentions are really, really unclear, more unclear than they have been in a very long time.
I have another question from, I'm hoping I'm saying the name correctly, Athena Tsapalis. It says, thank you for doing this. Please discuss how you think the existence and importance of TSM to the world economy, especially in the AI-centric world, influences the dynamic between Taiwan and mainland China.
Right. So this is another one of those interdependence questions, right? That theory in international relations that having a lot of economic interdependence, so really needing one another economically, is a factor that tends to produce more peaceful outcomes in international relations. And it's a problematic theory in the sense that we only know when it fails, right? So at the beginning of World War I, the European countries' economies were deeply intertwined with one another. And yet they had a World War I. So that must mean that this theory of interdependence doesn't work, right? The problem is, how many other wars might they have had? How much sooner might they have gone to war if they had had their autarkic individual economies and not needed one another for anything? So the motivation for war might be able to overcome the reasons why it shouldn't happen, but it might be much more difficult if there are a lot of reasons why it shouldn't happen. So with Taiwan and the PRC, eventually, if there is conflict, everybody's going to say, see, interdependence didn't work. But I'm going to say, how much sooner might this have happened if China were still Mao's China, right? If China had not opened up, invited in Taiwanese and other investors, become this incredibly important player in the global economy. If China didn't need to be in this with the rest of us, would they have waited until 2026 to solve their Taiwan problem, whatever that is? So, I think that it's not just TSMC and Taiwan's incredible high-tech, um, well, the incredible contributions that Taiwan's high-tech companies make to the world economy that's kind of holding back a conflict between the two sides. I think it's also all of the things that I talk about in the book, which are much simpler, more basic kinds of economic and cultural relationships that have, until now, and I hope for a lot longer, calibrated the level of frustration and willingness to blow everything up in order to get a preferred outcome, and instead inspired PRC officials to exercise patience, to try to cooperate and find peaceful ways through. So I do think that the fact that Taiwan is a critical player in international technological supply chains is hugely important, but I don't think it's the only thing that matters. And I think when people focus too much on it, then we get this other discourse of, well, then maybe we should just move all that high-tech industry out of Taiwan, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it. And I don't think that's the answer.
Thank you. Heather Mansell asks, in your experience living in Taiwan, What is the perspective of everyday Taiwanese people on the conflict? Are they afraid day to day of Chinese aggression, or do they feel that this economic relationship maintains the status quo?
Yeah. So in every Taiwanese temple, well, not every, some of them are pretty new, but like in your typical old Taiwanese temple from, the early 20th century, late 19th century, if you look up into the ceiling above the main altar, you will be able to see that there is a fabulous carved, painted, gorgeous ceiling up there, but you cannot see much because it's all covered over with smoke from 100 odd years of incense going up there. And there's all kinds of stuff hanging up in there. There's spider webs and dirt, and sometimes there are things that look like they could fall. But you're not nobody stands under there, venerating the gods on the altar, thinking, is that ceiling going to fall on me? It's lasted a long time. And this is kind of how Taiwanese see the status quo, right? This kind of dynamic and tense, but nonetheless pretty static equilibrium between Taiwan and the PRC. It has been here since 1945. We've navigated it successfully all this time. It makes no sense to them. Why would the mainland turn both sides of the Taiwan Strait into a war zone? What do they have to gain? It just doesn't make sense. They keep talking about how we're all Chinese, we're all brethren. So what, you're going to come over here and kill us so that you can prove what great brethren we are? So for most people in Taiwan, it's just very hard to see why Westerners, specifically Americans, are so worked up about this. However, in the last, really since around 2020, and then with increasing intensity after 2022, when the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, went to Taiwan, and she catalyzed, I mean, I won't say she caused, but her trip was the justification for a very significant increase in military activity around Taiwan that has not ever gone back down. That level of sort of animosity, bellicosity does make people in Taiwan nervous. And it does make people start to think, how much longer is all that going to hang up there in the ceiling? And is it possible that something could come down? And how can we be ready?
Interesting perspective. All right. Got an anonymous question. It says, we often talk about China's influence on Taiwan, but the book highlights the reverse. Is there a specific industry beyond electronics where Taiwanese business culture fundamentally changed the way China operates today?
I think so. Some industries only exist because of this relationship. And that to me is really fascinating. Like Foxconn, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about electronics, so I will move on. Foxconn, which assembles your iPhone, is a Taiwanese company. They went to the mainland. They're a contractor for Apple, obviously, and they figured out how to do this electronics assembly at an incredibly low price. So that's why any of us can afford an iPhone, honestly. So the way they did that was by adjusting and creating a form of industrial activity that is specific to the way mainland China works, the labor force in mainland China. So one thing that I think is really important to understand is that there wouldn't be a Foxconn. There wouldn't be this kind. There's no place else in the world where you can build a campus and 300,000 people will come and live at your campus to work at the factories on your campus. And they will go home once a year for 10 days. And then they will come back and they will live in those dorms and they will work. And if you want to accelerate the assembly line, you can add another shift and you can get people up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go assemble. Like there's not another country that has a workforce that will do that, that can do that. So I think one thing is just there are whole kinds of activity that only exist because Taiwanese companies, and specifically Taiwanese companies in mainland China, like put all those pieces together. But the question was really about an industry that's changed China. I think one way that Taiwanese investors changed kind of behavior in the mainland is the whole idea of um, affordable luxury and lifestyle brands and um, bringing mainland Chinese consumers into the kinds of consumer activity, behavior, preferences that feel really global, but that were not present in mainland China during the Mao era and in the early years of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. So, like the idea that you and I would go to a coffee shop and we would sit in the coffee shop and we would drink coffee, which is not a beverage that's traditionally consumed in China. We would drink coffee and we would eat a flaky pastry with butter and we would stay there for a long time. It's, Chinese have always gone to tea shops, but tea shops are for tea, and the tea ritual is different. And the food that you eat with tea is not the food that you eat with coffee. But, international brands like Starbucks, they went into China and they said, okay, Chinese people do Starbucks. But Chinese people said, okay, one, we can't afford that. And two, we don't like to sit there because it's not really a sitting kind of an environment, not like McDonald's, which McDonald's in Asia has always been a sit down restaurant. You get your food at the counter, but you can stay all day. It's not comfortable to sit there, and also we don't like that food. So Taiwanese investors look at that and say, okay, what's the price point that works in China, and what can we create for this market that allows people to participate in that kind of global experience in a way that they can really enjoy it. So 85 Degrees Coffee is this coffee chain that a Taiwanese investor created to do a Starbucks-like experience of coffee shop with coffee, with pastries, but pastries calibrated to Asian and specifically Chinese preferences at a price that Chinese could afford. So that's a way that, people's everyday life is transformed by a new kind of business that comes in and says, those people that you see on TV and in movies, you can have that too.
Interesting. Thank you for whoever asked that question. And the questions are definitely flooding in, which is great. So, and Zoom folks, keep them coming. So Heather Honeycutt asks, as someone who works in a CPG US company, I'm curious about the Taisheng supply chain model and how it was adopted by China. You discussed how it was leveraged in manufacturing businesses, but how do they also follow that model for consumable products? Heather Honeycutt, class of 06.
All right.
Again, I hope I'm saying all that correctly.
Yeah. So Taiwanese manufacturers were already in supply chains. they were contract manufacturers to all these Western companies. So, like when I was a kid, Schwinn was the bike you wanted as a kid. And those Schwinn bicycles were made in Taiwan. And in fact, bicycle manufacturing is very big in Taiwan. And one of my props that I brought with me today is this wire bicycle, which was made for me by the father of our Chinese lecturer, Miffy Tai Losher. Anybody take Chinese with Tai Losher out there? And Miffy's father worked in the bicycle industry in the big bicycle town in Taichung County. And when he retired, he started making bikes out of wire, like these little toy bikes. And this is a character, which is my surname in Chinese. So he made that one for me. Um, the Schwinn bicycle, initially made in the United States, but very quickly found that Taiwanese manufacturers could do metalworking. Um, they could provide the level of quality that American consumers were expecting at a much lower price, and they also could innovate on the product. So, even early on in the 60s and 70s, Taiwanese were already in the supply chain in the sense of being a contract manufacturer. But the disaggregation of the product so that it's not all being made in one place, and that the places where things can be made get more and more and more and more spread out, is more of a phenomenon of the tech industry. So if you're making a bicycle, there's a lot of heavy parts that need to move around. So that model works best if everybody is proximate to one another. And a lot of Taiwan's early manufacturing was this kind of cluster manufacturing where I am, if we're in the Barbie business, I make legs. I make legs and arms. I'm injection molded plastics. That's my specialty. I make legs and arms. You paint faces. She puts the hair in the heads and like styles the hair. Other people in town sew one kind of outfit. There are other people who do the injection molding of shoes and pocketbooks for Barbie. And then there's another household whose whole job is just sewing all that stuff onto the cardboard and then putting the plastic on and stapling around the edges. And we are together taking Barbie from raw plastic coming from Formosa Plastics to the finished product that's going out the door. But we're all close together because Barbie changes every day, and Mattel is constantly updating the molds, constantly updating the patterns, wants a different hairstyle, wants a different everything. So we have to coordinate ourselves to get that product where it needs to be in order for us to meet the orders. As the components become more and more and more specialized and more expensive, they can be made farther and farther apart. So there might be a chip that comes from Samsung in Korea that goes into another component that is assembled in Taiwan, that's tested maybe in Taiwan, that is then flown in an airplane right to the Foxconn assembly plant in mainland China, because the level of specialization that's required in order to make these incredibly high-tech things favors the most specialized supplier. So the supply chain, like spatially, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's still doing the same thing, It's kind of like the guy in Korea is making the pocketbooks and we're down here making the legs, but we don't have to all be close together because the value in each component that we make is sufficient to justify transporting it over distance. So there is a lot of high-tech manufacturing in Taiwan, and most of Taiwan's high-tech exports include components from Japan, Korea, other places, are based on designs from the United States and are going to pass through mainland China on their way to the final destination. And that's not really a great answer to Heather Honeycutt's question, but it's as close as I can get for you.
I was just gonna say, I hope she answered it. But well, no, that was, thank you, Shelley. Again, complicated topics.
Yeah, they are really complicated topics.
Best I can summarize.
Yeah.
So Richard Deal asks, what does the average mainland Chinese person feel about Taiwan?
So that is a great question, and I think it is fair to say we don't know. We can't really know. But it has been an essential part of the messaging from the Chinese government to the Chinese people for decades that Taiwan is part of China. It has been part of China forever. Taiwanese people are Chinese people in their blood. And the PRC state, the People's Republic of China government, is the legitimate manifestation of China, of political China in the contemporary world. Therefore, it's natural and in a way kind of inevitable that Taiwan should be under the control of the mainland China government. That set of ideas has been gospel in the PRC for long enough that I think it's fair to assume that for most mainland Chinese people, they just kind of take that as given. What they make of that in terms of contemporary politics, I think, is more complicated. But I cannot tell you the number of times that someone in mainland China has said to me, "Oh, China's Taiwan." Or once I was in a taxi in Shanghai with a research assistant, and he's a Taiwanese guy studying in mainland China, but we're in the taxi, and the taxi driver says to him, "So where are you from?" And what he's asking is, "What part of China are you from?" And my research assistant said, "Oh, well, I'm from Taiwan." And the guy immediately says, "Oh, Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China." So, I think it's fair to say that that is a virtually universally accepted principle in mainland China. But again, I'm not sure what it means to people in terms of what they feel needs to happen.
Terry Greenland asks, do you think President Chai?
PSAI?
XI.
Oh, she. Okay.
Excuse me again.
Sorry. What? The words are not spelled the way they sound.
How do you think their political calculations around Taiwan have been influenced by his visits from and discussions from Trump and Putin?
So my position on President Xi Jinping is not necessarily one that is universally accepted by other people who look at these issues. There is a great diversity of opinion about what kind of a leader he is. And so I am not claiming to be right. But my best assessment of his behavior, his statements, the kind of environment that he's in is that he has a very long view of his own mission and responsibility, number one, which allows him to be cautious and conservative. It's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is which gives him an incentive not to be a risk taker. And he is someone who has a pretty acute awareness of a very wide range of challenges facing his country. Putin, I don't think Xi Jinping is at all influenced by Vladimir Putin. I think he understands that Putin is a desperate leader who is extremely, what's the word, reckless, and will do anything for his own political and personal survival. None of those characterizations apply to President Xi. He is not desperate. He is not reckless. He is not in a weak position relative to the other people in his own leadership, relative to his own civilian population, or relative to the world. He is a strong leader in a strong position. And his primary goal, I think, needs to be not making a mistake. So why risk a mistake for something that is ultimately under control, even if it is not your final preference? So yes, Taiwan is not flying the PRC flag, but getting from here to there has so much risk and cost associated with it. And Taiwan is farther from flying some other flag than it has been in a very long time. So in some ways, he's got Taiwan very much backed into a corner. There's very, very little freedom of movement for Taiwan at this point. So to take it that last step, the cost benefit analysis, I can understand why it might not make sense to him. I don't want to say too much about Trump, but except that President Trump can make things harder for Xi because he can create a perception that Xi has an opportunity that for some inexplicable reason he is not seizing. So by appearing to soften US resolve to insist on a peaceful resolution of the disagreement between Taiwan and China, if people in China really did think, I don't think Donald Trump actually cares about Taiwan anymore, then Xi Jinping would have to answer the question, so why don't you do something about it before the US gets a different president who might actually, make it hard for us to solve this problem? So this is why I'm not focusing on so much the substance of Trump's positions as in the uncertainty that they create and the way that uncertainty destabilizes the logic that has been holding this this dynamic tension in a relatively static mode for a really long time.
Thank you. More questions are coming. I have Ben Carlson Peters.
Oh, hi, Ben.
Ben says, hi, Dr. Rigger. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm interested in learning more about what influence Silicon Valley will have on the trilateral US-Taiwan-China relationship. Jensen Huang specifically is of Taiwanese descent, and yet also wants to sell increasingly advanced chips to China. I wonder how this shift in willingness to work with China will undermine relationships with Taiwan and undermine Taiwan's defense capabilities.
So one of the most interesting policy decisions that the U.S. has made is, in that whole space, is denying China access to very powerful semiconductors on the logic that if they don't have them, then they can't do the fancy things that we can do. The risk there is that that has the effect of turbocharging China's motivation to make those things themselves. So are we creating a red supply chain in, high-end semiconductors by kicking China out of everyone else's supply chain? So I think part of Jensen Huang's logic is let's pull them in. Let's make them dependent on the same technology that everybody else is dependent on. Let's not have AI in Chinese and AI in English, or whatever the global language is, Esperanto. Let's not have two separate versions of the 21st century operating side by side. Like, well, you and I both have a PC, but half the people at Davidson have an Apple and a Mac, and it's a pain in the neck, maintaining two systems simultaneously. So I don't know, I don't know what the right move is, but it does seem as if, I see the logic of keeping China in the fold and not forcing a whole separate technology development universe in China. And Jensen Huang is such a rock star in Taiwan because, he is the AI guy, he's the NVIDIA guy. He is a huge consumer of Taiwanese semiconductors and a big thinker. Over the years, I've watched Taiwan, even just in the tech sector, move from on the Taiwan Fund, this investment fund that I'm a director on. We used to get presentations every year about the Apple supply chain. We haven't heard about the Apple supply chain in ages. That is old news. That is buggy whip, right? Then we got presentations about semiconductors. We don't hear those anymore. Now we hear presentations about the components of the AI, the GPUs, all the equipment that's needed for making the data centers that are going to supply us with all this intelligence now. How I feel about data centers, how I feel about AI as a college professor, for another evening.
That's another book.
But these are absolutely, they are Taiwan is the cutting edge of that entire ecosystem. It's not just the chips, it's not just the boards, it's the probe cards, which are what are this thing that you use to test a big wafer of chips. And the probe card looks like something from a science fiction movie. It's like tens of thousands of tiny little wires that all come out of, they're like attached to this board thingy, and they go down onto the wafer, and they all touch these microscopic locations, and they test. And it's if they light up the way they're supposed to, then it's a good one. If they don't light up the way that they're supposed to, it goes back and gets, I don't know, melted down. But that I was at the company that makes the probe card, and the investor relations guys giving the, and like this is a building that, if it were on this campus, David Holthauser, our director of facilities and engineering, would just hate that building so much because it's not a nice building. It's not a fancy building. But they're doing this thing that is absolutely essential that no one else can do. And the investor relations guy is kind of giving the presentation. And finally, this dude in the corner says, let me answer this question. And so he comes in and he's answering the question. And so one of the people on this investment board with me says, well, thank you for your answer. Who are you? And he's, oh, I'm the founder, I'm the owner, and I invented the probe card. And I'm working on one that will have 3 times as many wires in it. Like these kinds of businesses all have to be there in order for any part of the industry to function. So the idea that that someone can leapfrog over Taiwan and can do the kinds of things that need to be done. If they're just getting the chips, I think Jensen Huang's argument is if they're just getting the chips, they just have they just have the final piece, but they can't make it on their own. So they become even more dependent, not less dependent. I don't know who's going to win that argument, and I don't actually know who's right. I don't have a position. Sorry, Ben. But I think that's what the debate is.
Thank you.
But there's one question that I want to answer that wasn't asked, which is because I answered the question, what is the average person in mainland China think about this stuff? I want to say something about what the average person in Taiwan thinks about the conflict between the two sides. Because the story that the PRC government tells its people is rooted in the idea that history and ancestry, which we could also think of as ethnicity or nationality, that is determinative of who we are in the present. So Taiwan has been part of China since time immemorial. 自古以来, that's the phrase. And Taiwanese people have Chinese blood. And that is, this is not like, I'm not putting words in their mouth. This is in their documents. Those concepts of identity, nationality, citizenship, political belonging just don't make sense to people in Taiwan. People in Taiwan overwhelmingly believe the appropriate definition of political belonging is consent of the governed. Like if we want to be on our own, we should have self-determination. Like they don't want to like push too hard because they don't want to force China to take action against them, but also they just don't buy the idea that because our ancestors were from over there, we have to fly the same flag and we have to accept whatever government you have over there. Like it's 2026. That's not how nations are constituted anymore. So I think the dispute is really fundamental and philosophical, that for Taiwanese, being able to govern themselves and live the way they want to makes more sense than your ancestors, the way things were in time immemorial defines how they must be today. But those philosophical concepts are deeply held in Taiwan, and the opposite are deeply held in mainland China.
I want to be conscious of time. We've hit 9 o'clock. There are more questions. I fear we don't have time to address them all. As expected and anticipated, our Davidson community always comes with great questions.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to, thanks to the folks whose questions we got to. I apologize to the folks whose questions we didn't. I can give Shelley a copy of the questions, and if she's able to answer, maybe she'd be so kind.
Yeah. Or, people can send me an email. It's summertime and I'm feeling magnanimous, right? And I can also refer you to a couple of places where I've answered perhaps some of the questions that are in here. So the email convention for Davidson never changes. You know where to find me. And I'd be happy to respond as I am able to the questions that people still have.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much for the just clear passion and just raw knowledge and sheer passion that you have for this topic. I'm guessing most of the folks on the call know that about you, and that's why they've joined us. For those who never had the opportunity to hear Shelley, hopefully now you know why we love her so much.
Thanks, Judith.
Really, we're so fortunate to have Shelley and all the things that come with her into this Davidson community. A follow-up email is going to be sent to folks who registered for the call, and we can share some of these ways to connect and contact information. You've heard it here. Shelley's generously offered to answer what she's able, especially during the summer. And so be on the lookout for that email. It'll have her contact information, a short survey. It'll talk to you about the recording. This program tonight was recorded, and so that'll be online probably in about a week, give or take. And we'll let you know how to find that as well for anyone who wants to relive the conversation and delve into it, because it can be quite complicated, and or share it with any other folks who might be interested. And we just want to thank everyone who dialed in and joined us this evening. We are so grateful you decided to take some time and join us tonight. We'll be sharing a list of who was on the call with Shelley. I'm sure she'll be excited to see who dialed in. And we just hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. So thanks again, Shelley, and thanks to everyone. Thanks.